The next item for consideration is HR 1146, sponsored by Representative Huffman of California. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of the legislation. Without objection, this bill be considered as read and open to amendment. I will now recognize the bill's sponsor, Mr. Huffman, to explain the legislation. And Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership. Thanks also to my colleague, Congressman Lowenthal, for his support of this bill. And although he does not serve on this committee, I want to acknowledge my co-lead on this bipartisan bill, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and thank him and over 130 other co-sponsors of this bill for their support. This bill reflects a simple proposition, and that is that there are some places too wild, too important, too special to be spoiled by oil and gas development. The Arctic Refuge Coastal Plain is one of those special places. It's home to more than 200 different wildlife species, including bird species, that migrate from the refuge to states and districts across America, represented by many, if not all of us on this committee. You don't have to have visited the refuge to be impacted and impressed by its ecological beauty. And as we heard during the subcommittee hearing on this bill, we know its ecological bounty has a great impact locally in Alaska. The porcupine caribou herd is a vital source of subsistence for the indigenous Gwich'in people, and the herd's survival will be imperiled by oil and gas development. During the subcommittee hearing, I heard my colleagues on the other side of the aisle point to evidence that the porcupine caribou herd is doing just fine, which is exactly the point. At a time in which the 2018 Arctic Report Card found that caribou populations across the Arctic had declined by 56% over the last 2 decades, the porcupine herd has shown strength because of the protections of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. In the face of climate change, let's not mess up one of the few good things that are still going for caribou and the people who depend on them. I also want to make absolutely clear what this bill does, which is simply restore the Arctic Refuge to the status it had before the Republican tax cut bill of 2017. It doesn't roll back oil and gas development elsewhere in the state. It doesn't shut down activities in the neighboring National Petroleum Reserve. It does nothing to go after the existing jobs in oil and gas. It simply says you can't expand into this one special place, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. No one living in communities like Kaktovik, already working in current oil and gas production, should feel threatened at all by this bill. So I urge my colleagues to support it and to oppose any weakening amendments and yield back.
Does any member wish to be recognized in the bill?
Surprise, surprise, surprise.
Mr. Young?
Mr. Chairman.
From Alaska?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was like an echo chamber. I heard the gentleman just speak. It's an echo chamber. Same words I've heard for many, many years that mean nothing. Nothing. That area was set aside, the 1002 area was set aside by this Congress, headed up by the Democrats, to leave it open for oil exploration when the Congress decided to do so. And we did that. Not the whole refuge, not the wilderness area, get this, less than 2,000 acres of land will be disturbed out of 19 million acres. Keep that in mind, because I hear the same thing. How about the caribou herd and the Gwich'in? Gwich'in do not live there. It's the Inuits that live there, and they support the exploration and drilling in the area that we're talking about. The people of Kaktovik, you say they won't lose any jobs, they won't have any jobs. We gave them 76, we just talked about this, Nate, we gave them 76,000 acres of land for their social and economic well-being. This Congress did it out of this committee. But they're surrounded and they can't develop it because it's now classified, as you say, a wilderness area. They cannot use their own land. Fork and tongue, white man. This is an attempt to undo what Congress has done, and we did it in this House 13 times. Undo what, very frankly, is the right thing to do, and it was dictated to this Congress, and we did it. Now, I also shouldn't get too excited. I'm not going to ask you to stand in the bow of your boat again because I don't want your face wet. I'm not going to be really excited because the thing is dead as hell, and you know it. There's no way, and BJ's is ever going to get out of the Senate. But you're doing a disservice to this country and the people of Alaska and the natives of Alaska. Because we made a commitment and we're going back on the word of this Congress. So have at it. Do what you wish to do. I'm asking a no vote on this legislation. I do have an amendment later on. And I just want you to understand, though, this is a gesture to the crazy left-wing environmental group that somebody used to be a member of. This is not about the environment. This is about the oil. It's about the wilderness area. It will be wild even after the drilling might take place. 19 million acres that are sanctuary will not be touched. We're talking about less than 2,000 acres. Less than 2,000. This Congress said will be drilled when we saw fit to pass the legislation to allow it to happen. Set up by Mo Udall, set up by John Seiberling, set up by all the leaders of the Democrat Party at that time. So, again, the gentleman can have at it. I'm about out of time, and we'll see what you have in response, and someone's going to use some time. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time talking about this atrocious piece of legislation that doesn't have a chance of snowballing hell.
Mr. Lowenthal.
Yeah, I want to thank Representative Huffman and also Fitzpatrick for introducing what I think is a very important bill, the question of how to approach the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge has been going on for decades. Myself and the majority of Americans, it's a fragile ecosystem with exceptional wilderness values that are considered the biological heart of the Arctic Refuge. Fish and Wildlife Service has said it is the most biologically productive part of the Arctic Refuge for wildlife, home to the polar bears, caribou, as was pointed out before, hundreds of species of migratory birds, and countless other species. But the oil and gas industry has seized it as a promising cash cow with billions of dollars of oil. It's important to understand that once this area has been developed by oil and gas, particularly on the tundra in the Arctic, it is irreversible. The way the coastal plain was forced open as an unrelated provision, stuck into the 2017 tax cut for billionaires, it's clear that it was not thoughtfully or carefully considered. An economic analysis done for the attorney generals of 15 states and the District of Columbia found that any oil that was going to be produced on the coastal plain would not be used in the United States. We should not destroy a great American wilderness so that oil companies can sell more oil abroad. We should protect the Arctic Refuge coastal plain, and I thank you, Mr. Chair, and I
Will the
thank
gentleman yield?
for bringing up our markup today, and I yield to my colleague from Colorado.
Thank you so much. I feel so strongly about this legislation, and I want to thank Mr. Huffman for introducing it. I've actually been to ANWR. I've actually camped at ANWR. I've seen the caribou migrating across the coastal plain. I saw 65,000 caribou in one herd migrating together on the coastal plain. And I've met with my friends, the Gwich'in people, in their home village. And this is the kind of situation where it's a rare part of the world that is still pristine, that is still there for the indigenous populations and for the wildlife. And I agree with the sponsor of the bill, and I agree with you, Mr. Lowenthal, that we need to protect these remaining few wild places in this world, and we surely need to do it as we're moving away from fossil fuels And we surely need to do it so that we're not destroying this important, pristine area in order to produce oil and gas for other parts of the world. So I support the bill strongly. I think that it is one of the most important places we have left in this world, and I yield back.
But anyone? Mr. Lambert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask the sponsor of the bill to clarify something. I believe you said that you don't have to be there or visit the place to appreciate or to be moved by it. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I have been there, but I think many members and many Americans can appreciate the intrinsic value of this place without being there. Every poll shows that bipartisan majorities of the American people support protecting this place.
Are there other places in Alaska that have the same emotional resonance to you or others?
Well, I love Alaska. Don Young knows that. That's why we're such good buddies.
The national parks, for instance, do they have the same emotional content to you that Anwar does?
I attach that kind of emotional value to many special places in nature, Mr. Lamborn.
Okay. So you would include all the national parks of Alaska, for instance?
I feel strongly about all of our national parks.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Alaska.
I just, again, I listen to the same horse shit all the time. And what bothers me the most is you say the oil's going to be exported. That's not true. The oil has all come to the United States. In fact, most of it goes to California so you can burn it. And that type of dishonesty is not good for the public. It's not exported, not going to be exported. So don't make those kind of statements. I yield.
Would the gentleman,
Yeah, I yield.
when did I say that? I never said that.
He did.
May I?
Another Californian.
Yeah, I'm quoting now the.
I'll yield to the gentleman from
Yield.
California.
Yeah, that an economic analysis done for the attorney generals of 15 states. This is not coming from me. This is coming from an analysis that was done for the 15 states and the District of Columbia, found that the oil produced from the coastal plain would not be used in the United States.
Well, there's nothing in their tax bill that prevents it from being exported.
And I yield back.
I yield back.
Thank you. Any further comments? Mr. Palatano?
Just a statement that I've always wondered about. It pains me every time I hear something that, oh, it's okay to drill. We have the oil. The endangered species or any other species is okay. What we need to consider is, what are we leaving to our future generations? And I yield to Mr. Huffman.
I thank the gentlelady for the time. Just a couple of points in response to my friend Mr. Young's comments. With respect to prior Congresses, if any prior Congress intended this area to be drilled, they would have said so. They could have put it in the National Petroleum Reserve, which is right next door and was designated by Congress for petroleum extraction. They left this unresolved for the future. So let's not pretend that this was somehow always teed up for oil and gas development. It was left unresolved, and in the meantime, it has been managed for decades effectively as wilderness, and it is wilderness. Anyone who goes there knows that. Any of the qualities that one would attach to wilderness are there in full measure. And there is also nothing in the Republican tax cut, where this special place was opened up for oil and gas development, that guarantees that that oil would be used domestically as opposed to exported. We're exporting 3 million gallons of oil a day. We are awash in oil right now. So the idea that somehow this goes to California or some other place for domestic consumption is just a talking point. There's absolutely no assurance of that. With respect to the claim that there's only 2,000 acres that would be impacted by oil and gas development, that is simply preposterous. This so-called limitation is not a limitation at all. It is a BLM proposed interpretation of the project impact that doesn't count pipelines, gravel mines, and other hugely impactful activities like seismic exploration. When you look at a map that properly takes into account all of the infrastructure and all of the extraction and development that has to take place in order for oil and gas development to happen, it is a grotesque and irreversible diminution of the wilderness value of this very special place. And then finally, the point has been made that the Gwich'in people who are so passionately opposed to oil and gas development in this area don't technically live in this part of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Well, I'm so glad that this debate was preceded by one where I heard my colleagues across the aisle stand up for the rights of folks in Rhode Island to oppose a casino in Massachusetts. And so I'm certain that the application of consistency will bring Mr. Lamborn and Mr. Gosar into support of this bill, because the Gwich'in live right outside the border of the refuge. The porcupine caribou herd on which they've depended since time immemorial migrates right over that border. They don't stop at the border. So these are absolutely vital interests in any kind of meaningful consideration. Unfortunately, this administration isn't even consulting with them as it's rushing forward to try to get a lease sale out the door. But I'm so glad I'll have at least two of my colleagues with me on this bill, just by virtue of the consistency of the principles they were so passionate about a few moments ago. I yield back.
I just would like to thank the chairman and add my strong support for Mr. Huffman's bill. During our legislative hearing on the bill, we heard from those living in the Arctic who are experiencing significant climate change impacts every day. And thank you for coming back with, I'm sure, a very long trip for you. So I appreciate you coming back again. A new NOAA study found that the Arctic has recently experienced the 5 warmest years on record, while the amount of sea ice in the region is at an all-time low. The Arctic's more sensitive to climate change than much of the world. In fact, warming in the Arctic is taking place at twice the rate of that in the rest of the United States. Allowing for drilling in the Arctic will only further accelerate the changing climate, while also negatively impacting the communities that are already being forced to adapt to those impacts. The draft environmental impact statement by the Trump administration fails to consider several important aspects of climate change. How do we know this? The document ignored climate change to such a degree that the administration's own Fish and Wildlife Service had to tell BLM, which prepared the document, that it was underestimating the impacts of climate change. Some estimates have found that drilling in the Arctic could result in the same amount of greenhouse gas produced by 13 million cars in 1 year. The science is clear. We've got to sharply reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our country and across the planet in order to avoid up to $38 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars of economic damage to this planet this century. Those are the facts. Expanded drilling in the Arctic is not compatible with the facts or that goal. With this in mind, I urge my colleagues to support Mr. Huffman's bill to end oil and gas leasing in the Arctic refuge. Thank you, Chair Grijalva. I'll yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
He doesn't have time to yield. He's over.
Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's talk about facts. Let's talk about facts. This place is fascinating to me in that we have people who sit here and push these policies that have absolutely no experience in this field, none, and they sit here and invent facts. Let's talk about facts. We had an expert in the energy industry that sat right there in that chair, right there in the chair. When we asked him, we said, what happens when we stop producing energy in the United States? What did he say back? Yeah, I'd been here at least since the Clinton administration. Career official, not a political appointee. You know what he said? He said, what happens is we import more oil. We import more oil. That's what we do. And so then let's look at more facts. Let's look at the facts that when we import oil, you look at the facts, you look at the studies. You have a greater chance of trashing the environment by importing oil than when you do doing domestic exploration and production and putting it in a pipe. So we can sit here and invent crap, or we can look at the facts and we can actually allow the facts to direct us, to move us in a direction that will actually yield good policy in protecting our environment. I mean, we can just sit here and just continue making stuff up and just legislate on it. This has a real impact on real people. I agree with you, Mr. Levin, on climate change. I do, I agree with you. But this isn't the solution. And the oil's not going to be exported. I don't care what the Attorney General say. Last year, I think it was 97% of the oil produced in Alaska was used domestically. And yes, I think 3% of it went elsewhere. The majority of it, the facts show, actually went to California, went to Washington State and other places. So we can continue to sit here and just make things up and legislate based on that emotion, or we can actually look at facts, see what they say, and allow that to direct our policy. ANWR has become this emotional issue. It's not based on merit. It's become an emotional issue. Most of you, in fact, 99% of you in the room have never been there. You can't even freaking visit the place because it's a frozen tundra. It's not mountains. It's not trails. I'm all for protecting our environment. I am all for domestic energy and making sure that we do this from an all-of-the-above energy strategy. But we have got to stop just sitting here making things up, acting on emotion, and because what it does is it results in bad policy. Plus, we all know this bill's not going anywhere.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yield back.
Right here. Okay.
Ms. Dingle?
I wasn't going to say anything out of my deepest respect for the gentleman from Alaska who hunted in Alaska. My husband hunted with Alaska, thought he was one of the great men of this Congress. But I get upset when I hear this conversation and say that we don't have facts. And the fact of the matter is, the Fish and Wildlife Service calls this the only conservation system that protects, in an undisturbed condition, a complete spectrum of the Arctic ecosystems in North America. ANWR has been called America's Serengeti for a reason. It is home to a variety of species, including caribou, polar bears. It's a lifeline for tribes like the Gwich'in, whose way of life depends on this. And I know that you know more than I do, my dear friend Don Young, and I hate even saying this, but I know this is one area where you and John Dingell disagreed. And he thought that you couldn't put the genie back in the bottle once hundreds of miles of road and pipeline and drill pads are in place. So there are people that have been there. There are people that have studied the facts. And I think it's really good that we're having a good discussion. I hope we can do it respectfully. And we all care about the environment. But there are real facts that say that this is the right thing to do. And that's what I did want to say.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady because I did want to respond to the comments of the gentleman from Louisiana who said that we have to base our decisions on science, and I couldn't agree more, which is why I was sort of horrified, having myself been to ANWR, as I said, when he said it's a frozen tundra, because in fact, I was there in June. I know Mr. Huffman's been there too. I don't know if anyone else on this committee's been there, but in the spring and summer and fall, the ANWR is far from a frozen tundra. There are thousands of species of plants and animals, more mosquitoes than you could ever count in your life, and the caribou. We saw caribou. We saw black bears. We saw polar bears. We saw a gray wolf. We saw a plenitude of wildlife and of plants, and so that's just not correct. And I think if we're going to base our assessment on science, then we need to look at science. And we are finally developing a huge amount of domestic oil through fracking, as we know well in my state of Colorado. But what we're trying to do is move away from fossil fuels. So why would we take a place that, as Mr. Huffman says, has been managed as wilderness for decades, which is, believe you me, I've been to a lot of wilderness areas, the wildest area that I have ever seen. Why would you take that and drill when we're moving away from that direction? And I think it's just essential that we preserve this. But let's not have in our mind that this is some remote frozen tundra, because it's not. And I thank the gentlelady from Michigan for yielding, and I yield back to her.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. Let me talk about a couple of statements that have been thrown out here so far. First of all, Mr. Huffman, when you ban oil in Rhode Island, we will be there with you. Number two, Mr. Lamborn, yeah, you can get feeling of this area without being there. When Pombo was chairman, he took a delegation up in January, which I thought was dumb, and Nunes told me it took him 2 months to have his joints unthaw afterwards. Mr. Young, I have some problems with your language. I object to you hearing the word horse. The rest of it's okay. And you're actually accurate, Mr. Graves, with California as far as oil. I don't know if this is going to go down there. Today, California has 57% of all their energy from oil that is imported from foreign countries, and that percentage is increasing. Now, let me talk about this bill and a couple of other problems I have. This bill is a partisan bill. It's a dogmatic bill. That it's true, we have been talking about it for decades, and I haven't heard anything else that was different from what I first heard about this issue 17 years ago when I arrived. But what is different is obviously what Mr. Young said. This bill will never get out of the Senate, if indeed it gets that far. It will be vetoed by the president. It's going nowhere. It's going to produce nothing. We are spending a great deal of time talking about nothing. But since you're rolling votes, no one is here to listen to it anyway, so I guess it's a net wash. I do have a sense of hypocrisy and frustration here. All of you have talked about our national parks. In fact, one of you said you love the national parks. It's great. We have a tremendous backlog in the maintenance of our national parks. There is a bill out there, that happens to be mine, that has 182 co-sponsors. It's amazingly bipartisan. However, we have never had a hearing on that bill. In fact, the chairman, who was my co-sponsor last time with that same bill, and his staff is helping to drag their feet on it, part of which they say is because there will be a score to the bill and there is no offset. They first have to find an offset. The hypocrisy comes because this bill also has a score and there is no offset. So my procedural question is why we are spinning our wheels with this bill that is going to do nothing, which has no offset, and yet that becomes one of the reasons why doing something in solving the park backlog is postponed, because there is yet to find an offset.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
No, let me get done. Last time this bill was actually introduced, it scored at $1.1 billion. That's the offset that needs to be found, and there is no offset, which means even if this bill comes out of committee, and probably will because you've got the votes for it, if this bill comes out of committee, it's going to languish around simply because you haven't balanced off the offset. And yet I still get the problem that trying to solve the park maintenance backlog is being postponed and delayed because we need to find an offset somewhere. To me, that is hypocritical. Second thing that I find hypocritical about this is I had to listen to everyone, including myself, who talked about how wonderful the LWCF was. What a great institution it was, how great it should be. And it should be not only maintained, but it should be fully funded. And what does this bill do? It takes money away from the LWCF fund. If you really want land and water conservation, then fund it. Take the energy royalties and fund it. But this bill, to make some kind of dogmatic partisan statement, is going the exact opposite direction. You can't love LWCF and then take the funding away from it at the same time. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to see something that we can actually get done that is good. I want the park maintenance backlog to be heard. I want it to go forward with or without an offset. The CBO score, I think, is stupid in the first place. CBO is usually stupid in the first place. But the net result is that needs to be there. And that's what I would like to see, which would be a lot more time than rehashing what we have been rehashing for decades on a subject that's not going anywhere in the Senate, that's not going to ever be signed by a president. It's just nothing. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Before I yield to Mr. Huffman, I think it's important for this committee to deal with the kind of choices that the American people have to confront as well. And anticipating what the Senate will do and anticipating what this White House will do is conjecture at best. But I would say that I support very much the legislation that Mr. Huffman has presented to us today. And no matter how you feel about the issue, and this goes back to the point that Mr. Young that we've had these discussions over and over again. No matter how you feel about the issue, I think we can all agree that including a drilling provision in a tax giveaway bill that was orchestrated by the majority at that time, the Republicans, without any hearings or votes in the House is It's shameful. And the Arctic Refuge is just too wild to drill, it's too special to drill, and it's important for not only the indigenous folk, but for the life that exists there. I think this bill returns us to where we were before the Republican tax giveaway was jammed through Congress using procedural tricks. I don't think the Arctic Refuge should ever be sacrificed to big oil, but if that is going to happen, then Congress should debate that directly, not tack it onto an unrelated bill. And I urge my colleagues to support this legislation to protect one of the last great, truly wild areas in this country. And with that, let me yield the balance of my time to Mr. Huffman.
Well, I thank the chairman and appreciate the ranking member's pointing out of what he is arguing today is hypocrisy, because this bill does not include an offset. Let me remind everyone that we're having this conversation about Arctic drilling because it was tucked into a Republican tax cut bill that, guess what, did not include an offset. In fact, we're trillions of dollars a year in the hole because turns out our fiscal champions on the other side never did provide a pay-for these tax cuts, and they didn't pay for themselves, and future generations will be paying the price so that billionaires and corporations can get a windfall at a time when our economy was doing just fine and they didn't need that windfall. So don't talk to me about hypocrisy, especially on fiscal issues, folks. It is a glass house over there. Now, this notion that we hear from time to time that we got a binary choice. We have to either drill and use more oil from Alaska and other special places like the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge, or we'll have to import oil that we have to use from some other part of the world where it's less environmentally sensitive. Well, it's not quite that binary, folks, and this often comes back to California, and you folks want to tell us that it's California's thirst for oil that is driving some of this. We really need to have a hearing in California where we educate you about what we're actually doing on energy policy going forward, because it is not about more oil. We're very anxious to lead this country and the world away from this false choice of more oil from special places like the Arctic or more oil from the Middle East. There's a third way, and that is less oil. And leaving oil in the ground in special places like the Arctic Refuge is a great way to start down that path, which should be the future for this country and the world. Lastly, I want to just say, Mr. Graves, we often find common cause when we talk about policy based on science and fact, but it's more than a little patronizing to say that anytime you want to protect a special place that has very unique environmental values, that's only emotion. There actually are some facts and policies that are very serious and should not be belittled in that way. So let me bring it back to some facts. If we wanted to do this right, this effort that the administration is now undertaking at breakneck speed to try to rush lease sales out the door, they would at least conduct the proper studies to understand the environmental impacts of what they're trying to do. And we learned recently that there are 17 secret memos from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, or 17 studies identified in secret memos from U.S. Fish and Wildlife personnel, scientists, that were buried by this administration. They weren't produced in response to FOIA requests. They weren't produced to this committee. We got them because public employees for environmental responsibility somehow got them through leaks, and we now know they're there. But there's 17 studies that would have to take place before you could even understand the environmental impacts of a lease sale. And guess what? This administration tried to deep six those studies and that internal admission that those studies would be necessary, and they're rushing full speed ahead with a lease sale. I yield back.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm rather ambitious goal before the voting. If we'd like, the goal is ambitious. Try to start voting by 12:30. We have 2 more bills after this one, and don't want to cut anybody off, but any cooperation trying to reach that goal would be welcome. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just in the interest of the discussion and where it's gone, I think for anyone not to recognize what's happened in the economy since the tax cut bill is not only living in a glass house, but a cracked one at that. The economy, as we all know, is booming. But in the context of some earlier comments of consistency, Mr. Huffman, and the discussion on climate, I would just bring good news to you that today I'm filing a discharge petition for a vote on the Green New Deal, which I myself and I think everyone on this side of the aisle recognizes is a radical, horrible resolution, one of which you are an original co-sponsor. So I just want to give public thanks in advance for your willingness to sign on to that discharge and lead the way with that regard. But I would yield the remainder of my time to my friend from Louisiana, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Congressman Heiss. I want to respond to a few of the things just to make sure that we continue to stay factual. Number one, tax bill, my friend from California. Highest unemployment rate for women, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans than we've seen in decades. In fact, Hispanic, Asian, and African Americans, lowest unemployment rate in history of the United States. We received the highest income taxes in a given month in the history of this country last year as a result of the tax bill. In regard to California's energy policies, over the last 20 years, as my friend from Arkansas pointed out a few hearings back, California's dependence upon foreign oil increased from 16% to 57%. Let me say that again. Over the last 20 years, California's dependence upon foreign oil increased from 16% to 57%, including bringing it in from countries like Saudi Arabia, Colombia, Ecuador, Kuwait, and others. I think it was 37% of it is coming in from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Brazil, Mexico, Angola. So that's happening. Now let's talk about the concerns of the gentlewoman from Colorado about how we're taking this habitat away. Let me put it in perspective. The size of the land that will remain protected within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is comparable to the states and the District of Columbia. So the District of Columbia, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Delaware, Connecticut, New Jersey, combined. So lastly, let's go back to the comments about, we're trying to move in a direction of no more fossil fuels. I'll remind you, pointing back to the witness who testified before this committee, who is a career civil servant for the federal government, who said, when you decrease supply, you do not change demand. Instead, you rely upon imports. We see where California is importing their energy from. There are other options, I guess, that are out there. Maybe we could import from Venezuela. I don't know what your preference is, but it doesn't change the dependence or the utilization. So I hate to introduce facts into an otherwise convenient discussion, but the facts don't line up with some of the things that are being said. Yield back.
For the discussion? Sir, Mr.
This is going to be very brief, too, and so I can get on to another quickly rolled vote. I just want to respond to Mr. Huffman in one sense. You missed my point when I was talking about the offset. I really don't care about the offset or not. What I care about is the fact that we need to solve the problem of park maintenance backlog, and that is being dragged on here because we don't have supposedly an offset. So we will spend time talking about this one, which does not have an offset. That is what I'm saying is hypocritical. I want the other issue. I have 182 co-sponsors for the park backlog bill. That is something that has to be done, the purview of this committee. I don't want it held up. But if this one is going to come out here without an offset, then I sure as hell want the rest of that done, with or without the offset. And with that, so you can roll this vote too, and I've got 4 minutes left, I'm going to yield back. No, I'm going to yield back to Mr. Cook, who is yielding back. Who just yielded back to you, yeah.
Thank you. Any further? There's no further debate. We can begin the amendment process. Without objection, the ANS offered by myself is considered as read. Mr. Young, you have the First Amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the desk. I have an amendment to the desk. Yeah, I do. It's circulated already.
We have it.
Yeah, It's already circulated. Well, he has-
You'll recognize Mr.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment is straightforward, and it's also in the spirit of self-supporting and self-determination of our native people. My amendment requires the consultation of the Inuit people who reside in Alaska's coastal plain, in the village of Kaktovik, before the repeal and energy exploration of the 1002 area of ANWR. The Inuit people of the coastal plain have the subsurface rights within ANWR, as provided to them in ANSCA. And this is their ancestral homeland because they should have a say in the decision-making process. You heard me say before, this land was given to them for their social and economic well-being. And if we do what we do in this bill, at least they should be consulted and be reimbursed, or at least allowed to produce oil on their lands. That's all it does. This is a good, upright, self-decision-making for the people of Kaktovik, the tribe that live there, not the ones that are 500 miles away. I urge my colleagues to support it.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Huffman?
If the gentleman is interested in a meaningful consultation process with Native peoples, and I certainly share that concern, then we should agree on an amendment that stops the current rush to a lease sale in the Arctic while a proper consultation occurs that includes not just the Inupiat people in Kaktovik who want to drill, but also the ones in Kaktovik who don't want to drill, because some of them don't, and also the Gwich'in people who are not part of that meaningful consultation right now. And all of that should happen before we're moving forward with the lease sale. So if the gentleman would consider that, then I would say that's a good step toward the kind of consultation we both can work on, but we've got to stop the lease sale while we do it. If he wants to move forward with drilling in the absence of consultation, then I would oppose this amendment as a gimmick.
I didn't expect anything else.
Ms. Holland?
Thank you, Chairman. And with all due respect, I oppose my colleague's amendment. Everyone knows that I'm deeply committed to ensuring proper tribal consultation with tribes about federal policies that impact them. But this amendment isn't really about that kind of tribal consultation. If it was, Republicans would have insisted on this provision before the Arctic Refuge was added to the tax bill and opened for drilling. And they would also be insisting on consultation with the Gwich'in people who get sustenance from the porcupine caribou herd that will be directly impacted by drilling on the coastal plain. The point of this amendment is to delay protecting the refuge until this administration is able to give it away to oil and gas companies, and then at that time, it would seemingly be too late. If we stop the leasing process first, I would fully support a thorough consultation with the Inupiat and the Gwich'in and look for ways to improve the quality of life of the people of the Kaktovik without drilling the Arctic Refuge. With respect to the point being made about the Gwich'in people not actually living there, just because certain Alaska Natives don't live there doesn't mean they don't have an ancestral tie or a caring for the land. I experienced that with my protection of Chaco Canyon. That's my ancestral homeland. I don't live there. No, I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but it means a tremendous amount to me that land is not desecrated. And I think that there's a higher issue here, which is sacred places. These are lands that, I mean, look, Alaska was the last frontier. There were people who had lived till past the 1920s before they saw their first non-native person ever in their lives. We owe it to all of the Native people living in that area to consider how they feel about the land, and that is what true tribal consultation is. And I also just want to speak up for the animals for a change, because they can't speak up for themselves. And currently, climate change is really doing a number on our animals, especially in that region. If you haven't seen videos of the animals starving because there is no food. It's a terrible sight to see, but I just want to say that somebody needs to speak up for the animals, and that's what I'm doing here today as well. And I yield. I yield to
Any-
Mike Levin. I'll yield to
Levin?
my colleague, Mike Levin.
Mr. Levin?
Thank you. I just wanted to briefly weigh in on the matter of California's oil consumption. Such a discussion is completely intellectually dishonest without including the key information that in order to meet our state climate change goals, we are dramatically reducing our dependence on all oil, by increasing fuel efficiency and accelerating the use of alternative fuels and electric vehicles. The electricity to power those vehicles is now being generated by cleaner sources that are less dependent on fossil fuels and oil as well. So if you want an honest discussion, let's stick to the actual facts, policies, and priorities. And if you want a more further examination, I'm sure that Mr. Huffman and I would be glad to host you in California anytime, and I yield back.
Go back. Discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, hearing no further debate, the question is an amendment offered by Mr. Young. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have roll call being requested, and it'll be the recorded vote. All those, the recorded vote will be postponed pursuant to my prior announcement. The next amendment is from Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first, I'd like to ask you to...
Could you suspend for a second? We need to pass out the amendment.
You bet.
Graves number one. Graves number one.
Graves, number one. It's been distributed.
Number one, the one that says limitations. Mr. Chairman, is it okay if I do a UC request while they're handing it out?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, in response to some of the dialogue with my friends from California, I would like to submit for the record a statement demonstrating that between 2011 and 2018, the oil imports for the state of California on a barrel basis went from 300,000 barrels to approximately 370,000 barrels of foreign oil, which would be a 70,000 barrel increase over that 7-year period.
And you're submitting for the record?
Yes, sir.
Without objection?
Thank you.
Everybody's received amendment number one. Mr. Graves?
Good? Okay. Mr. Chairman, this amendment simply addresses two things. Number one, it does ensure that my friends' concerns about offsets, they have an opportunity to address those by including an offset for any revenue that would be lost as a result of the passage or enactment of this bill. Number two, again, if this action, this underlying legislation, HR 1146, will result in us pivoting toward greater dependence upon renewables, fantastic. So this bill just ensures that that we would not have an increase in foreign imports of oil, as we've seen from California over the last several years, but that the energy that would otherwise result from the underlying law would be replaced with renewable energy, because we would hate to see a scenario whereby it would increase our dependence upon foreign energy. And as we all know, there are actually less safe practices in terms of exploration and production, and certainly, as the National Research Council and others have found, by the transportation of that energy from other countries to the United States. So I share my friends' concerns about the global environment, not just that of the United States, and this amendment would ensure that we don't further pose a threat to the global environment as a result of the underlying legislation.
Anyone else on the amendment? There's no further debate. Hearing no further, the question has the amendment offered by Mr. Graves. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and amendment is not agreed to. Thank you. The vote, recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, please indicate by raising your hand. Sufficient number. Having done so, the recorded vote is ordered. The vote will be postponed pursuant to previous instructions. Any additional amendments on this legislation? Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have a second amendment that just once again providing an opportunity.
If you could suspend, Mr. Graves. It was filed late, so we need to distribute the amendment first. Thank you, Mr. Graves. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just along the same lines, I want to give a chance for folks to ensure that our global environment is protected. So what this amendment would do is it would have a consideration by the Secretary that the elimination of the energy production resulting from the ANWR would not result in a greater environmental threat to the United States as a result of the import of energy. And as we've seen, the state of California importing over $27 billion worth of oil from foreign sources over the last few years, we would hate to see an increased threat to the environment, because certainly HR1146 is established, as I heard the bill's sponsor say, that this is designed to protect our environment. So I want to make sure we have an opportunity to do so. Yield back.
Mr. Lowenthal?
I'd like to correct some of the things that my dear friend from Louisiana is saying. California does import a great deal of foreign oil, you're right, but it goes to California refineries, which are then sent to the rest of the country, just as Louisiana is the third largest state in the nation in terms of foreign oil imports. So it's not just California, it's Louisiana, and Louisiana has many refineries, and they sell it to the rest of the nation. So this is not oil that is not sold elsewhere. This is oil because we're a West Coast state, and we receive oil that comes from the West Coast. Louisiana receives its foreign oil from a large number of other places because of ports there. But remember, Louisiana imports almost more oil than almost any other state in the country from foreign sources.
Will the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to hosting you down in Louisiana, because I want to show you some of this.
I am looking forward to
Louisiana is home to the only deep draft oil import terminal in the United States. It's capable of accepting a super tanker. So this loop facility is then connected to an oil network that connects to it. Give me some wiggle room on the number, but I want to say it's 24 states, something like that. In addition, one thing else that distinguishes the state of Louisiana from California and many, many others is that we actually are a net exporter of oil from Louisiana, meaning we produce more energy in the state than others do. And last, I can't wait to take you to a facility in Louisiana where we produce diesel and then send, I think, 75% of it to California.
Will you yield back? You make a great point about California accepting foreign oil. So does
right there,
Louisiana.
just stop.
Is there going to be red snapper on these trees?
Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment submitted by Mr. Grave. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The recorded vote being requested. Those in favor indicate by raising your hand. Sufficient number. Having done so, a recorded vote is ordered. The vote will be postponed. Are there any additional amendments to the legislation? The chair, the next item for consideration is HR 1568, sponsored by Representative Moulton of Massachusetts. I ask unanimous